right, we are back for another episode. And last week we talked about return to pitch, and this week we thought we would talk a little bit about this time of year. So this is gonna air like mid-January. So right now we're recording this more like early January. That matters just like a tiny bit probably. So just understanding, the time of year that we're talking about, kind of coming out of break for both our high school athletes and college athletes that we work with. And talking through kind of like what time of year is this? Is this off season? Is it not off season? Is it preseason? What does that mean with what our athletes should be doing? What happens when they take breaks during the break? So that is an interesting wrinkle, I think, for everyone, of like when they take some downtime during the holidays, and how we have to accommodate for that and what that looks like. So maybe Ashley, you start and talk a little bit about kind of thoughts and considerations you have going into this time period for pitchers.
Sure. I'll start with the college level because the college level is ahead, meaning the season starts sooner. Our high school level athletes, they're usually like March at the earliest, depending on where they are. Obviously, we know some high school athletes have fall season, so we're not including that. But anyone that has spring season, it kind of starts in March, and obviously February, at least for Division I and Division II, that's where the season's starting. So they are ahead. The goal over the fall really was for the college level pitchers, was to deeply understand them, their strengths, their challenges in ball flight data, just at its basic level in the bullpen, command, whether a pitch is only good on one side of the plate versus another, identifying the holes, seeing if they had any issues with translating that data into live and competition, and getting to know them well enough that not only could we design the right plan for them over break, but that the athletes were educated on it. And the reason I start with that is because it's a long enough period of time. Like preseason starts in my mind in about 2 weeks at the college level. And it's a long enough period of time, and it's where it lines up in relation to preseason, where if the athletes just go home and just go back to doing their old stuff or aren't educated on like, this is what we need from you when you return, it can really be tough. And the reason for that is because of what I just said. This is mostly the first week for most athletes coming back. Some are a week behind, so like based on when their school starts. So this week or next week. And we're really saying, okay, we've got about 2 weeks to treat as an extension of off season. And so what we really have done is assessed, where are they? Where are they based off of where they left? Is it the same? Great. If it's the same, great. Is it slightly better? Excellent. Is it a regression? And if it's a regression, is it within range of like, no problem. We're talking, we need 2 extra inches of break on that pitch. Command was a little off on changeup. Like nothing wild here, right? Not just like a full regression into, wow, it's as if we're starting in the beginning of fall. And so we're spending these 2 weeks really kind of as an extension of off season. We are kind of knowing that we're spending still some time in like pitch design, pitch development, unless an athlete showed up and was like, not only is it exactly as we asked her to bring back, but it's even better, then we're pushing it a little bit more. We're really starting to go into this, like, which tools go to arm side, which go to glove side, which are only good against righties, which are only good against lefties. Like, let's fully understand this picture. Let's start to develop the craft and train the craft in the bullpen of execute both sides of the plate, blending, tunneling the pitches you have, and now take a break, as if there's like a half inning where you don't throw, because that's real, and then go back and do it again, and then go back and do it again. So we're really keeping an eye on how many weeks until that first week, until that first competition. What are the demands of that pitcher? Not everyone is like, I need my pitcher to throw 7 innings, right? We're like, what are the demands for that pitcher? What's her role? What are we expecting? Let's work backward, and then let's understand where she is. If someone shows up and their tools have significantly regressed, what we are talking about is going all in for 2 weeks in a full off-season mode to see what we can resurrect. But then the time starts to run out. And now we're like, we have to just work with what we have and talk about leveraging that. And then there are things, obviously, of like the percentage of time you're calling pitches. There are things like throwing a pitch off the plate versus on the plate during certain counts. These are all preseason concepts. There's a lot to do in preseason. So it's never like you're totally bailing on like player development concepts, but you have to start to pull away from them in order to really talk about like execution concepts, because that's really important, obviously, and just leveraging what's available to you. So that's where we are right now. There's been a couple of cases where in the college world, they're like, I'm not so sure if X pitcher will have pitched over break, even though she had a plan. I'm like, what? Like, hopefully that's not like, if there are colleges out there where their pitchers might be going home and not pitching, that it feels like a forfeit on the season. Like that is literally our last attempt at off season to build the resilience in our body against the pitching motion, which is now just only going to get more and more demanding. So to really hit it from a strength and conditioning standpoint, to be as strong and resilient as possible, to really just like hone in on the craft of what you do before it's about the execution of that craft. It's the last chance. So if you show up and all of that is like blah or has regressed, and that's where you're starting right now, we will run out of time. We'll have to sacrifice one for the other. So it's not an option. Like we did that in our day where like you'd be like, oh, what, like 2 weeks before you went back, not even 3 days before you went back.
Right. Like, I gotta get,
and like threw overhand and pitched a little bit. So it looked like, but we're not, that's literally apples to oranges. Like there's too much information. We're talking about, we need your drop ball to have 8 inches of sink, to be at this velocity with a changeup that does this. Like that's not the language we spoke back in the day. So there's too much there. There's too much information for it to just like, oh, I threw within the week just to like not get hurt this week.
Yeah. I want to like pull apart a couple things there because I think there's a couple really important things. One is you don't have to do that much during break to do what we're talking about. So I think the other thing is like, if you go to a school where you throw really long bullpens every day, or you hit for hours every day, it feels impossible to keep up with that. It's probably not the right plan anyways. Like you probably shouldn't be doing that much at school anyways. And that's definitely not what you need to do to keep up. I mean, we had college athletes come back and train with us, and it's like 3 days a week. They come in, they get, a very good focused training session, and they are going back in most cases better than when they, came in. And it's just like, educate them for a second. What are we going for over these next couple weeks? And then 3 days a week, go play video games or hang with your friends or do whatever else you want on the other time period. It's like, it's so minimal to keep up with that. So I don't think we're asking a lot. And probably what I would say is, I mean, there are probably exceptions where athletes just aren't motivated. They've just gotten away with being not motivated. So that's the exception. But in most cases, I think sometimes that comes from like the overwhelm of you're doing way too much at school, and then you're trying to maintain that. And that's just like, that's not, both of those are probably not right. You're probably doing too much at school, and you definitely don't need to maintain this like hours of training every day or some element like that. So I think that's one thing. The second thing I think is really important, and you kind of went over it quickly, but I think this like concept that definitely was why we were like, we gotta do stuff at the last second. And this concept that I think still comes into play often. It's like a old school mindset that I don't think we've kicked yet, which is basically like the punishment for not coming back in the way that you should is that we either do some sort of conditioning to test it. We ignore that your stuff isn't there and we just jump ahead anyways. Like we basically are like, well, that's the consequence. You have to be ready. So whatever, we can't do anything about it. And I think it's really important to go through maybe a little more detail of like, you can't do that. The punishment is that you stink. The punishment is that you aren't good enough and you aren't going to have a good, like the role that you thought you would or something. But this idea that like, oh, she was, when she left, she had 8 inches of sink and now everything has 4 inches of sink, but we got to ignore it because now we have to work on command. It's like, no, because that will be bad. So I think, or like she was supposed to lift and she didn't. And so we're going to do this fitness test anyway. And now she has a pulled quad. Like, no, what is the actual like culture and consequence on your team for things like that, but not like, let's hurt someone to prove a point, it's not as malicious as like hurting someone, but let's put someone at risk for those things. So I think we still see that a lot. I don't know that there's quite an equivalent to hitting, although I'll talk through a couple of hitting concepts of this time of year. But I think in pitching and in like strength and conditioning, we do still see that kind of a lot. And I don't think that's the right focus. You have had to have built buy-in and culture in another way than that.
Yeah. And I think there's also this element of like week one, some schools, I always ask, what do you want? At the end of the day, like in the consulting world, like you're the boss. You literally could say, I want to do X. And I'm like, I think that's a bad idea. And they can be like, don't care. And I'm like, okay, here's what we're going to do. I mean, I can give my recommendation, my advice, but they're the boss. And so some schools want live that very first week for a variety of reasons. The D2 level, by the time they get back, there's like 3 weeks and they play. So they're like, we don't. So the plan included to start doing that over break, right? So, I mean, but some of them want live right away. And it is important for them to know, but that's not the season. So this idea that like when they come back, it's going to be like, that's the like their max, they have to show that they are the absolute best. It's like, but we actually don't want that yet. We want to understand this slow, like based on how much time you have. We can do probably like 3 weeks of preseason mode where it's all about, the execution of things, which gives us this many weeks, 2 to 3 weeks of like continuing to build that, like ease in. It doesn't have to be this like cutthroat, you're going to show up and you're going to do this. Like, it's like, we've got to see, and hopefully you're going to show up exactly that allows us to keep progressing that. And if you're not, like, we got to try to hurry things up a little bit because the timeline is the timeline, or you're not going to be good enough to get out there. I mean, there's some, obviously, is what you're talking about, right? It doesn't always just like, can't always just make it work. I think that's interesting, Krista, because this is what we run up against in the high school season. Like our high school athletes, sometimes their games aren't until the end of March because it's freezing. They're scheduled at the end of March, but like sometimes they don't play till like early April, whatever. But like it's tryout on March 1st. So we have to like, oh man, really, we lose a month because there's no sense of like the game matters. Like, let's use that as the timeline. And I get it. Their tryouts are tricky. It's the high school concept, but we have to prep them as if like March 1st or whatever, February 20, whatever is like the day they have to be at max. And it's kind of shitty, because it's like, actually that's not it. And even in the college, some of the best programs in the country, they're also understanding. No, I want her to max in May. Like I want us to feel like we're building. So I've got to be careful with what our goals are, and we can't lose because that will get held against us later in the season, of course, with like selection and rankings and such. But we've got to make sure we're preserving this athlete. There's just like, sometimes there's no sense of that either for some collegiate programs, and certainly not at the high school level.
Yeah. I was going to say, I think the live concept's interesting because it really shouldn't have anything to do with pitchers. Like it's very interesting. Like I think there is this thing of like if I think of pitching, I think of MLB, where we have the most control over a professional athlete, has enough money and enough buy-in that he cares very much about the whole year and what his training looks like. They're pitching live, like maybe they pitch live a little bit at home training, but otherwise they're in spring training for a month and they pitch live a couple times during that. And that's fine. They are just starting to build up their stamina at higher intensities. They don't see this need of like competing. Like I think there's a hard element. So it's kind of like, it would be an easier conversation if we remove that from pitching, where it's tricky. And this is real. I think this is real as the hitting person of like, hitters need to see live. Like it is not live to hit off a machine. That is not the right timing. It is not there's a big gap in translation between hitting off the machine. You could be up in velo, which we've been able to accomplish more. Is like, I'm seeing more velo. I'm seeing less predictability. I'm not seeing just front toss. And so you'll be closer to that jump, but it's still a very big jump between machine and live. And so there is the reality of there has to be a time period where hitters hit live. Now, there are people coming up with solutions for this. Like there's the machine that some of the MLB teams have that's like $300,000 or something, where someone's pitching a ball out of it. So like, obviously that would be great if that was the solution, then we wouldn't have to use arms. There are some people who have managers on staff or coaches on staff who can throw. So that's another great option if they can really throw. I think we're not talking about arm circles here though, like someone who can really deliver a pitch. And so there are some workarounds for it, but that's the tricky part is you're going to have, if you are not getting your hitters an element of live, you're going to run into issues. But I think if you think of that instead of like, oh, my hitters need to see live every single day, it's like maybe, but also just make it a part of the program. And so what are we focused on for your hitters? They need to have some at bats. They need to bridge this translation. It's the same way that like pitchers don't go and throw millions of times full intensity live. Hitters don't, they really shouldn't need that. If the gap for them is like, it's not just about a few focused reps and it's like they can never get up there. Well, I don't know if their training like set them up right. And so I think that's what you're really balancing in this time of year is that the reason people want to throw live, well, maybe should want to throw live week one, is not because the pitchers need it. I think we've got to get out of this mindset of like the pitchers need to compete. You're going to have time for that. That should take like 2 weeks. That's not going to take a bunch of time. But if it's because the hitters are at a time period where they are probably, where it's good for them to see live a certain amount of times, I think thinking of it more in terms of like, what's the reps? What's the actual reps that a hitter needs live for us to close that gap for timing? It's really for timing. It can't be about other things. Like it's got to be about timing and pitch recognition, right? And so what are the gaps we're trying to close in that window and how much does she need to see to do that? And don't be random with it. I think the other thing that we run into with this is it's just like, go hit 3 times off the live and there's no purpose to it. There's no like, what are we focused on? Are we trying to get that hitter to pick pitches? Are we trying to get her timing? Do we then go watch video so we get even more out of that live? Like what is our back and forth on this? I think that's the real conversation. But I think that's the tricky thing is that's real. Like hitters do need to see live, they need to see live because the gap is big and that's really what you're balancing. But I think if you can understand that, you can start to at least ask the right questions about like, what are we trying to accomplish here by having live? Or you can go find a manager who can throw. So then you can throw less of their pitchers.
Yeah, I'm with you on the like the week one must throw live. The only thing that I will say there's obviously a big difference between baseball and softball is like throwing under fatigue is at the center of softball pitching. It just is like,
right. Yeah.
And so we have to like test what happens, so one, we have very rigid arm action under fatigue. And so just by nature of our like underhand movement. And so what we really do want to see is like when intensity goes up to live, how rigid does that make the arm? Does it change velocity? Does it change break? There's some element to that. And then okay, we know that she's going to need to throw live back-to-back days. That's not going to happen in baseball. They're not trying to test. Yeah, we know she can come out on Friday and be great. But like we also need to know what happens to her on Saturday. And so there's testing. I don't know if that has to be a week one concept, so I don't disagree. But there's a lot of live is this like testing. We're trying to expose the holes so we're not shocked by them in season, right? So we can know like, okay, as soon as she got to pitch X, we started to like not be able to she was not able to like sustain what she could do. And she's really struggling on back-to-back days right now. She's like not recovering the way we need her to. So it's like those types of things, which is just an element that's specific to softball, obviously. But I'm with you. I definitely think there's a big piece of it that is rooted in the like culture of like, you got to compete harder.
Yeah.
And
right. You got to compete harder. Like, put you under.
Not doing a good job of being able to throw enough balls. I'm like, we should not expect her to do that right now. Mm-hmm. That's the last piece. We're literally like, are your tools good enough? If the answer is no, we got to stay in the bullpen and keep our focus in the bullpen. We can maybe do a little live if we need to, but like, it's got to be bullpen based. Are your tools good enough? If your tools are good enough, do they have holes on one side of the plate versus the other? Do they have holes versus righty versus lefty? How are we maximizing that? What are the holes we can fill? What are the ones we can't? How do we just know that? And then the next piece is like, yes, is it translating live? And then the last piece in my mind is like, can you manipulate them with such a degree of command that you can then put it just off the plate, just on the plate? But that is literally like the most maximized level of the craft and is going to come at the very end, not on week one. Can't do that.
Yeah.
We can, but no, we're not going to. We're not going to do that.
Yeah.
I want to kind of like bring it back a little bit more, I'll say big picture. Thinking about our high schoolers specifically, because the holiday time of year, I feel like is always such a tricky, it's a tricky time of year for them to navigate. And I think even, with the college athletes as well, there's still a component of like, the totality of all of their stressors, right? So we are talking about in this conversation physical stress, obviously, but they're students, which affects college and high school differently, but in the same vein. And so, we always often talk about, like, especially like from strength and conditioning, that the holidays represent sort of this like naturally imposed deload, right? So like the academic stress is coming down for them after, a fall semester or a marking period, whatever their vibe is. And then essentially it's like, and then I think we don't often recognize or appreciate that like that structure gets lost. The school structure gets lost. They're then home for a period of time where they should arguably rest, right? It's been a stressful semester, marking period, whatever. And I can appreciate how in seeking that rest, they're like, okay, well, I'm just going to take totally off because I've lost a little motivation. I don't have this like, these additional stressors that kind of keep me up and going. And that's why I think it's even more important for colleges, especially, to send your pitchers home with a plan, to send them home with some structure of how to, one, leverage a little bit that they're just natural stressors, assumingly that the holidays are not overwhelmingly stressful for them, but their academic stress is down. You can fill that physical bucket a little bit more right now. I think that's what a lot of college coaches kind of miss about this time period, is that you can use it as a way to continue a physical ramp up. It does not have to be this, 4 to 5 weeks, whatever their time period is, where they're just doing nothing. The physical part, because the academic side is less for right now, you can push that a little bit. And I don't know if we've been afraid to, or that we just haven't had the communication or the systems or the right things to hand to pitchers. But, I feel like you can push a little bit during this sort of mini off season, in preparation for, and include that concept in your preparation for what happens when they come back to campus. The high schoolers get this additional level of complication with, they are trying to stay, and college too, but I think it's a little more challenging with high schoolers right now. Camps, winter tournaments, these opportunities to play live. We have been talking about the college level where there's a lot of things that coaches can control, and that they can control all of that physical ramp up, and they know exactly when their first game is, and that's what they're, attempting to plan for. The high schoolers, we have some of them that are like, I've got a camp every week in January. I have a camp every week in January, and we know they're going to be throwing high volume. So this opportunity to have this like gradual, slow ramp up, it gets interrupted for them a lot. In the same concept of like camps over winter break, like it's just such a fluctuation for them in adding this throwing live or significant volume of stress. That's like they don't ever get this opportunity to just like take a very gradual approach, right? We're always kind of going between this really high volume, this really high chronic stress, or nothing. And we know from particularly pain and soreness management, that windshield wiper effect, it ain't good, right? And so that also applies though to this off season for the high schoolers, that when their fall season is done, presuming they don't play basketball or play a winter sport of any kind, it's hard to take that gradual approach. And I don't think we appreciate that enough, that they get asked to play in these winter tournaments and these times to throw volume when it's different than what the college pitchers
I was going to say, as you were talking, I was like, I just don't get it. Like, can we please stop throwing live in winter camp? There is no point. You watch them in games. Like, I just don't get it. What I want to know from a camp, like, please, colleges, like, if you use data, that doesn't even make sense. Like,
right. Literally.
Like, I don't get it. What I need to know, like, we have a hitter going to a camp this week. What I need to know is, like, what is her exit velo? Take a slow motion picture of her video, of her swing. See where the holes are. Like, does she have big holes? What is her underlying power? Can I measure that? Like, what are the metrics? What is her ACT score? Like, what are the things? Does she fit here? Like, that's it. Talk to her. Make sure she's a nice human being that you enjoy a conversation with. Like, ask her what her training looks like. Those are the things you need from camp. And then if you're like, well, okay, she checked all those boxes, but I didn't get to see her live, go watch her play live in the summer during her season, or go watch during high school season. You're allowed to do that. Like, I don't even get it. What are we doing? And like, there is zero reason for tournaments. I just like, what are we playing in tournaments for? Like, if you are playing in winter tournaments, like, it's not just let me communicate with my coach to make sure I don't overthrow. why? Like, why? It's just crazy. Like, I was thinking while you were talking, why, like, we had an athlete who played with me when I coached travel ball and trained with us. She came back this winter from college and made more change in 3 weeks with us than I ever was able to accomplish with her the whole time she was training, because she came back. Like, it's just, this is the first time in her whole life that she's not just so tired, because that is what we do to athletes in high school. We just exhaust the shit out of them. And then we're like, you're not good enough. It's like, well, that's impossible. Like, they cannot train that way. And so I think, like, one, this idea that you can't make change in college, get out of here. You can make more change than anyone can make, because those athletes, for the first time ever in their whole career, are being controlled from a workload standpoint. And the ability you have to make change on those athletes is humongous. Like, it's just unbelievable. They're the most fun athletes for us to work with too, for the same reason. Like, so get out of here with that. Like, that doesn't even make sense. And from a, like, high school athlete, it's just like, they're so tired. I get the point of camps. I'm not saying camps should go away, because you need to meet them. You want them on your campus. You need to make money like that. I mean, there's a reality of all of these things. And also, they do not need to throw live. You have plenty of opportunities. We are making those kids spend $15,000 at tournaments. So use one of those to go watch them compete live. Like, I don't get it. I just, like, that is so frustrating. We deal with that every winter. Like, if anytime athletes are in pain or they're having issues, like, that's the root. The root is, this is off season, and we didn't build volume for them to go pitch 3 games. We didn't know that they were going to pitch 3 games, or we are getting backlash of, like, we're not seeing the change we want. It's like, well, your program doesn't get to be off season, because every other day you're throwing in a tournament or you have a live camp. And so we don't have time to make change. Right. Like, we don't get the opportunity to go through that. So that is 100% the trickiest part of the high school time period right now, is that, like, right now in January, for 2 reasons, we should still be just smack dab in the middle of off season, because most of them aren't going to actually play a game until mid-March. And, like, because most of them aren't supposed to play a game from mid-March. Where that gets interrupted is twofold. As Ashley already said, we lose the 2-3 weeks before the first game, and we have to assume that, like, they're going to be asked to pitch at the highest intensity every single day the minute they walk onto high school. So there's a conversation about, like, how can we manage high school preseason? Like, can we come into high school preseason more educated about, like, that being part of their preseason? And then the second thing is that it becomes a joke to even call it off season for some of these kids, because they are actively playing in tournaments, or they're going to camps where they're being asked to throw a very high volume of live. And so they don't get to do off season.
The first thing that I want to say is it's nice for the role reversal. Normally it seems like I'm about to flip a table, and I feel quite calm. And so, Krista, welcome to my world. Yeah. Computer. But I will say, of all the years, every year we have this conversation about, like, why are the athletes being asked? As from my perspective, from OGX pitchers, this has been, every year gets better and better. People are getting more and more educated. People are either choosing not to play high school. Not saying that no one should play high school. I'm just saying these are the types of examples of things people do. They are like, we will pick 2 camps, and that is it. And we will tell our coaches we are not playing in a tournament in January. So I do think we have struggled with this type of, like, so much less. This is in the walls of OGX, not in the walls, but in the, like, OGX bubble. So let me be clear about that. Because people are starting to understand this concept. Like, okay, is she going to compete all winter, or do you want to grow? Because you have to choose one or the other. We can't develop and compete the whole time. And so I think that's important. I also think something that is interesting to point out is that I heard Josh was answering an athlete on Slack, one of our pitching coaches, one of his athletes in our, like, Slack communication forum yesterday, because they were like, her velo is down. And I would say about at least 85% of the college athletes this week, their velo's down. And some coaches are like, we're fine, right? Like, that's normal. We're going to go up. I'm like, yep. And some already know that. Like, I know that's going to go up over the next couple of weeks. But, like, don't every year, Krista, isn't it like mid-January to, like, early February? Just everyone just takes
skyrockets.
PRs.
Off.
Everybody does. It's wild.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that also
holidays are crazy.
I was going to say, when you were talking, Laura, about the, like, off period for the high schoolers, one of the things we see is, like, I joked, like, 2 weeks ago I was in the facility and I was like, wow, it's a train wreck in here. like people looked like a train wreck.
Right.
And
Right.
I literally was like,
What did you eat the
Sally,
last
what
3
time
days?
did you wake up today? And they were like 2 p.m.
Right.
Right.
Like that's the reality. And so I think that also the thing is like, we had a conversation yesterday of like, we're so, like don't play a lot, don't play in tournaments this winter, don't do this. But also the flip side of that is that I don't think you should do those things, but also I think you should recognize that these are children.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that there's an element of like, what we say is like, oh boy, like, gotta get back to waking up at 7. Like you look like a mess. And
like,
then we'll joke about it.
Double
with them.
plyos is good today.
Right.
Yeah.
Like normalizing just like whatever. It's just like we've normalized. And I like agree with you that we'll have athletes. And I think this is a little easier for the athletes who are like able to train with us all the time. And it takes a little bit longer and some more communication with our remote athletes to get a sense of this. But way more now we have athletes who are just like, I didn't do much last week, so I'm going to like just do plyos twice today. Like they on their own say that, they know how to ease themselves in and they don't freak out. It's not a big hiccup in their journey. It's just this like, okay, no problem. Then we'll build up into that. But I think I think there is this balance between, I guess they're kind of related. It's just like, let's treat kids like kids. And so they're allowed to sleep till 2 during winter break. And also like, they're probably going to stink. Because of that. Like, it's just like totally deregulating. And also like, they shouldn't be pitching live every single day because they're kids and this is their off season. Like there's like, it's the same thing. It's like, can we treat kids a little bit more like kids and not expect them to just be like performing 12 months out of the year at all costs? I just think like that is crazy. It's just like, that's not the right approach. And it makes the athletes, you see them, they get so disheartened and they just, it just sets up very unrealistic expectations for what every time of year should be.
I think for a variety of reasons, the college world and the high school world are so different for a variety of reasons, not just because like the college world starts sooner and the athletes are older and stronger. The reality is one, the season in college is February through May, June. That is the season. Let's say February through May, obviously, plus a week or two there. So that's the season. For our high school athletes, their season is basically June, July. You know what I mean? And so there is this element of like, even if an athlete was like, I'm going to take off the entire month of December and they're in high school, we'd be like, okay. So here's what's going to look like once you get back. Here's the ramp up. Then we'll use these 3 weeks to go after development concepts. Then we'll turn preseason, probably a week or two. Then you're going to have high school. And that's what we're going to try to accomplish in that time. And like, it is what it is because you're going to have high school. And I think you can't do that in college. That's your season. That is like, it is literally preseason. So we're going to call it preseason because it's high school. But let's be very clear. The season is literally not the same. The second thing is that what I'm advising on college consulting calls is how to optimize as much as possible. They're still human beings. They still are stressed about school or have some family things going on or whatever. But we're trying to optimize whatever we can, the environment for the college athlete, because there is so much control over what they're doing. There is no optimization at the high school level. That's a train wreck, right? It's just like, I'm going to have a camp. I'm going to have 3 camps. I'm going to go to this camp. They're not going to throw live, but they're going to throw me for 3 hours straight. And also my team has a tournament. And also I'm going to go, my high school workouts started last week.
I'm exhausted listening to your example.
My high school workouts started last week and I'm a PO, but I also hit at practice and I also throw overhand. We're like,
and I have travel practice.
Exactly. So we're like, yes, you do. So all we can do is not say you can't do any of that. What we can do is educate. Listen, we have to understand if you're talking about max development, it lives over here. Very rarely are we ever discussing max development at high school level. It's not even possible. And so we're like, is there any wiggle room with this? Do you have to throw overhand, I don't know, 3,000 times on Tuesdays at high school open gyms? Or could we do like 4, which actually matches what the hell you're going to be asked to do in the game? You know what I mean? So like, and they're like, no, I can't ask that. I'm like, got it. So we're going to take that into consideration. It's just this kind of give and take. What are the variables that you're bringing to the table? And we will educate you and ask you if any of them can wiggle. And if they can't, which most of them don't, and most of them can, it's like, okay, then let's set some realistic approaches to what we're going to try to accomplish and in what time frame and and that's what we do in the high school level. We're not maximizing these athletes because the variables don't allow it. It's just the reality.
Right. Well, and what's also different about high school is like on top of everything we just listed, we're asking kids to do that much physical activity. and eat one sandwich that whole day.
Yeah.
Right.
Like there's the reality of like the biggest change, in addition to like there's so much less fatigue, is like every single college athlete comes back having put on masks and looks different because they get food or they have time to freaking eat. Like they just are doing it. So it's like you burned, hey, 16-year-old, today you burned 8,000 calories from the moment you woke up until the moment you walked out the door, and you ate 2 peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. Like the math ain't math here. And so it's like, they're like, I want to go up in velo. It's like, what are we talking about? You know? So it's like, I literally, you know, the episode I did with Mike, I was like, throwing harder is a solvable problem, but the way to solve it sometimes is putting mass on. And it's like, it's a solvable problem, meaning we know how to solve it. It doesn't mean it happens all the time because of all the variables at the high school level that we run up against, which is also why I want to like shake the screen. College coaches, like you can do so much. Like you have so much ability. I'm like, God, I would love to hit with college athletes. You just have so much more ability to change. Really quick on the hitting side on the college level, I've gotten some like feedback from some of our athletes that they have gone back and like, it's like, well, now we have to start because you had break. And so now let's hit off the tee for an hour. And what I would say is like, no, there's this like time. We just said they're going to have a big gap between like machine, hopefully, which you do, to live. And so you are starting at the machine front toss level. They all should have also gone back with a plan. You know, what our college athletes did for the ones that we programmed for over break at the collegiate levels, we grabbed some video and checked in just like basically how much, really from a posture standpoint, like how off is their posture. And if it was more on the bad side, then we would put in a little bit of T work of just like, let's try to clean that up as much as we can. And so, you know, in an ideal setting, they wouldn't come to us in the winter break with posture issues. Like that's something we'd clean up in the fall. But if they do, that would be the case where we would give a little more T. But then that's it. It's like, okay, it's front toss to make sure we're hammering that. We're hammering bat path, we're hammering posture. And then they were already, all of our college athletes were very variable off the machine, change of speeds, different spin directions, different angles for their posture, like different, every day was something slightly different. And so they 100%, the athletes that trained with us this winter went back, and where they are ready for is live. Now you might ease into that a week or two, but that should be what they're doing. Like T is kind of 0 like, to minimal.
If a pitcher shows up, and I think like pitching coaches understand this, if a pitcher shows up in college and it's like the only place that we can get her to throw good enough tools is at low intensity, and it's January, you know, right. I'm like, then we should schedule a meeting to talk about red shirting, because basically gonna do it. It's like, wow, she's really hitting those -9s at 75%.
That
like
math ain't mapping.
Way to go. Yeah. You know, like that's just the amount of time we have, the amount of capacity.
Right. Well, I just said the gap.
The same thing,
we
right?
We all know it. Yeah, the gap between, I just said, I think the gap between, and I think we have made so much strides in the past few years incorporating machine. Our kids are ready to see velo. They have way more adjustable swings because they see different spins. Like it's a massive help. So you definitely 100%, the majority of your training should be machine most times of the year. So like, I'm not saying machine stinks. I'm absolutely not. But there is a massive gap between machine and live. Massive. Because there is the timing is not the same. The spin is not the same. Like there is a massive, massive, massive gap here. And so if you are coming back this time of year and you're starting at T, like, oh, we already said there's a big gap here. Like we are a mess. Like that doesn't make any sense. So it's like, if this is not an argument for or against T, we do T work in our facility. So like it has its limitations for sure. It's a stationary ball. We know swings are different on the T versus live. So like there's a whole bunch of conversations about T's translation into anything. So that aside though, that would be like the day one for pitching. It's not even low intensity. It's like, we're going to do snaps.
Right.
Like, it's so far
that
from where you were trying to get.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's so far from where you were trying to get. It's just like, no,
right.
Like you can't be there. And so I think it's like in an ideal world, they are going into winter break as hitters with their posture cleaned up, and you're just trying to hold it during break. So they have some sort of drill set that holds that for them, And then everything, you still might be going after a little more bat speed. You're still pushing some adjustability. Like you're still going after those things in time of year where you're starting to really change things up. So they're seeing different speeds, different spin. Like that should have been started going into that time period. And that's what winter they should be holding up with. Now it's tricky. They go home. Do they have access to a machine? Do they have like hitting is tough. And so the other thing I was going to say, as we're saying here, is like, people can come train with us. So there are facilities where you can go train. You can train we had kids come in from out of town and stay for a week. Like trying to find places where you can have that feedback and that access to make sure your stuff is where it needs to be. I think we had kids who came from programs that don't work with us, who maybe were a little behind because of injury, because of being a freshman, who came into assessments and then trained, have some time period. Like we had all different variety of that. So I think there are some solutions for college athletes that way too. But I think from hitting, we are a little slow. It's just like, we can't be doing that now. And then the alternative can't be like, we have T and then every other day we hit live. It's like, there has to, we've had
right? Like the lack of planning. When we say like what's going to be expected of them and that's what you're working up to, think about the things that you just broke down from a hitting standpoint. It's like, it's velocity, it's parts of the zone, it's change of speed, it's you can hit when it's low and away, but when it's top spin, but not when it's bullet. Like there's so many variables. The more detailed you are in the data, in objective variables, the more you know. That is all time to be able to get to that. But if you aren't, it's the same in pitching, right? This idea of like, does it have the right break? Do you change speeds enough? Can you throw it arm side? Does it go glove side? Does it only go to righties? What is that tool against lefties? Can you be able to manipulate its height when you need to? Like the more details that you have and the things that you're going after, the more that you're like, well, that's not going to all happen in 2 weeks. So, but if you don't, if you're a coach and you don't think about all of those variables, if you're not using data, if you are, but you don't see it in some sort of like systematic type of way of what you're going to, and you're literally just like, we're going to go T for a week, and then next week we're going to go this. If it's the more general your brain is operating as far as what it actually entails to be successful at whatever level you're getting to here, then the more you're like, we've got plenty of time, right? And so I think that's where it comes from. And so I think just like, if that's where your brain is, you have to be better. I mean, that's just the reality. There's way more to it, and you have to be better.
Well, I think, go ahead, Laura.
I say, the ultimate goal, whether you're the college coach who's managing the college pitcher, or you are the parent helping, the young pitcher, hitter, whoever, athlete to manage themselves, the goal is to stay in a window of stress, which means that we often talk about, too much workload, right? Doing things too often, too frequently, too high intensity. But the opposite is also true, right? There is not this world where you can say, I'm going to take 8 weeks off and come back better than ever. That is not, it's a recipe for disaster, right? Which is, again, we talked about velo goes down right now because stress in general for these athletes has gone down. They're not in their, academic side. And so like, if I have one thing that like, I could say, I just want anyone who is managing an athlete to think about is like staying in this zone of stress. So when you're trying to plan, college coach, you're trying to plan, you're backtracking from your first game. What are the things that you need to test essentially to see, okay, when push comes to shove, she needs to get out of that zone a little bit. I need her to step up. I need her to be able to go extra innings. I need her to be able to, have stamina, for lack of a better word. But then how do I help her come right back in that zone? And so like, I think recovery is a huge area that we all, I think, is just in general in the softball world, we get very, very, very distracted by gadgets and gizmos. And I feel like I'm about to sing a Little Mermaid song, but like, seriously, we get distracted by that. And what you're really just trying to do is her nervous system has to get amped up, and how do you bring her right back down? And then on the flip side of that, if you've had time off, you can't just jack your nervous system up right away. We have defenses against that. You want pitching or hitting or whatever you're doing to feel good and to not be sore. You need to take your time of applying that stress. And so you have to you want to stay in a zone. So every time a winter tournament, a camp where you're throwing for 3 hours, you're just jacking yourself up out of that zone. And if you have no strategy to bring yourself back, meaning good strength and conditioning, good low to moderate training, you're setting your body up to just maladapt to that high stress. And you staying in the window, just stay in the window. Don't spend too much time above and don't spend too much time below.
Yeah, I think that's a good, and like kind of, and to conclude what we've been talking about, I was thinking like it's twofold. It's periodization. It's the idea of periodization and being able to do that. And it's also systemization, which is creating systems around an individual athlete. And so periodization is, let's understand the stress that's going to be expected of this athlete at different time periods of the year. So what you're saying, Laura, I think is like, there's going to be some. And so we have to understand where it is, and we can't come way off of that. And also we don't want to go way above that. If we're really thinking about periodization, the reason it's so hard in high school is because it's like, I'm going to stay at max for 12 months. And we're like, well, that doesn't seem great. Right. Like that, you know, there's not a window for that. But if you're thinking of like, okay, here's the buckets of stress I want. Here's the build I want, right? So it's like summer is going to be low. If I'm thinking of a college athlete where we actually have some control over it, summer's going to be low. Okay, well, what happens if that athlete, I ask her to go play this summer, you know, like maybe it's going to be a little different, but where is this going to be? And then it's fall, it's going to be, I'm going to have games. And then, you know, the interesting time about this time of year is we're saying like, it might come down a little bit. And like, is that okay? Is that what we want? How do we build back up into that? And I think what you're then asking on top of that, it's like, understand that, lay that really out, understand where it differed off of that because a pitcher pitched in the summer league, because whatever, like it differed off what you thought the periodization was going to look like. And then what you need also happening in the background is that individual athletes, you know, independent data and what you're going for during those time periods. And so it's like, I have an opportunity. I have a hitter who has really poor posture during her load, and I need to clean that up. I'm not cleaning it up when she's up here. So I need that time period to be summer, maybe a little bit into fall. Like, here's the objectives for that kid. And then I understand that like she's going to need to get to here. So here's how I'm going to ramp that up slowly for this individual athlete. I think you need both of those. And where we have struggled because we haven't seen training like that, this knowledge of, you know, periodization, of rest, recovery, of the central nervous system, you know, some of that is new information that we're getting access to, because we haven't been able to see it. And on top of that, we certainly haven't had the resources to like systemize that or the ability to do that. We have those now. And so it's like, that's the bare minimum that you have to do now as a coach to manage your athletes. And so this idea of just like, we're all going to do the same drills and they're going to be the same intensity all year round and like, good luck. Like that's not going to work. That's not going to work. And you might accidentally stumble on some good results for kids because maybe that matched that kid a little bit of what that kid needed, but it was an accident. Like it wasn't.
Yeah, I wonder how
much
that happens in hitting. Like, you know, I kind of live in a bubble because the coaches I'm talking to, they're working with us. And generally I do think there's a culture around pitching where it's high individuality. There always has been. Now, pitching lessons are like, everyone, this is what we're doing today. I'm not talking about pitching lessons. I'm talking about the college level. And we're looking at what each pitcher is bringing to the table, how that's matching what we need from time of year, whatever. But I wonder how much in hitting, my assumption is that in the hitting world, people go in groups a lot more.
Totally.
Yeah. And that just makes me want to die to think about, because that is so, as you're explaining, I'm like, right, that is horrible. And then I'm like, that doesn't really happen in pitching. I'm sure it happens in pitching outside.
It happens in pitching because we like, outside of our bubble.
Absolutely. But like in my world, it doesn't really, you know, or it doesn't.
Yeah.
And so then the thought of like, oh, right, people are just having their entire team, like with maybe very, very basic levels of individuality, but just do and progress in the exact same way. That's awful. That's just, there's no other way to paint that. That's awful.
Yeah. So periodization, systemization, two things. We're interviewing already for our fellowship for the summer. And I got asked a couple, a lot of times it's college coaches or people who are going in, they want to go into the college game. And one of the things they ask is like, what do you think the biggest thing I will be able to take away from this is? And I say, like, without any hesitation, systemizing player development. Like it's such an underlearned skill, and you will be such a better, less stressed coach when you learn how to maximize that part. And periodization is easier. It's not followed all the time, but it's easier to think about generally the concept of periodization. Systemizing on top of that for some levels of individuality and preparation is tougher. It can be done 100%. And I think that's,
that's can be done.
Yeah, that's what coaches need to be thinking through, and athletes need to be thinking through. If you're a high school athlete and that your program doesn't feel like that, or you're a college athlete and your program doesn't feel like that, then go find some way to have a system around you, because that's going to be your best way to manage all of the variables we're talking about. So, all right, that's a long one. We really crushed that.
I know we crushed that one.
Quite long.
persistent tables on the COM one. I don't even know what's happening here. Welcome to 2025.
Yes. All right. Well, until next week, think about periodization.